It's finally Friday.
It's Friday, Friday.
Thank God it's
Welcome back to the Friday Show, presented this week by the Woodbine Jackpot $1 million Carryover. I'm Scott Jagow in studio, along with Ray Paulick at Del Mar Racetrack. Ray, this is a big weekend for the 3-year-olds. It is Travers weekend at Saratoga. Unfortunately, some negative news has been coming out of Saratoga as well. We'll talk about that. But first, let's start with this court case in Kentucky that could have wide-ranging implications for the thoroughbred industry. It involves trainer Graham Motion. A judge overturned a ruling against him for a medication overage, and this has to do with thresholds and the science behind that, and also the absolute insurer rule, which states that a trainer is responsible for what happens in his barn no matter what. What did you make of this ruling?
Right. Well, Circuit Court Judge Thomas Wingate overturned a steward's ruling, calling the medication guidelines or the threshold levels arbitrary and capricious, saying that there was not sufficient science on which they were based, and also saying the absolute insurer rule is unconstitutional and needs to be reworded. So on the science part of it, the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium, which made the recommendations for the guidelines of the threshold level that's used by the Racing Commission, they came out with a statement saying there is science behind it. And I say to them, tell it to the judge, because that's the way this is going to go. But threshold levels are complicated. We can't get into all the complications of it. But suffice it to say that medications can be given different methods, orally, intravenously. Graham Motion gave a muscle relaxant to his horse over a period of time. He cut it off well before the recommended guidelines, but the drug still showed up in the horse's system. He's not really at fault, but under the absolute insurer rule, where a trainer is at fault no matter what, he's at fault. The judge said that isn't fair.
Yeah, and this has been in place for decades in every racing jurisdiction. It's been challenged in court several times. The last time it was overturned was 1969, so generally the courts have upheld this standard, which on the face of it sounds unfair. I mean, when you're an American, you think about the Constitution, it sounds unfair. If your child commits a crime, do you have to go to prison? No. If your car is stolen and the person gets a speeding ticket, do you have to pay the speeding ticket? Of course not. So you can, and I feel bad for guys like Graham Motion who, just want to keep their reputation intact as being on the up and up. But at the same time, when you have money being bet on animals, integrity is of the utmost importance. And the standard, I don't see how you can have another standard. If you, make it a looser regulation, then people will be able to take advantage of it and say, hey, it was contamination. Hey, I didn't have anything to do with it. I didn't, so I think that standard has to be in place.
Yeah, in this case, the Kentucky Racing Commission has an option of appealing it to a higher court, and they so far they haven't said whether they will or not. I would assume that they probably will. You've got to have rules, because without the rules, what this ruling means is that any trainer across the country can cite this particular court ruling and say, see, this absolute insurer's rule is bogus, and therefore I shouldn't be suspended or fined for my drug violation, which could be under entirely different circumstances.
Right.
It's a precedent-setting ruling that could be cited in future cases unless it's overturned.
And it's kind of similar to, you have these standards in place because you have this sport that's highly regulated, and as I said about the money and the animals and all that stuff, but it's similar to, say, the NFL. It has its own standards and rules that are, different from the standards that you would find in court, for example, criminal court. Ezekiel Elliott, the running back for the Dallas Cowboys, is suspended 6 games this season, even though the police and the prosecutors couldn't find enough evidence to charge him with domestic violence. The NFL said, yeah, but there's enough smoke there that we think something happened, so we're going to suspend you under our rules. So, there are precedents for having these separate rules when it comes to sports.
there's one part of this case that does bother me a little bit, though, and that is that George Strawbridge, the owner, Graham Motion, the trainer, wanted to introduce evidence at their administrative hearing, which was done before it went to civil court. And the administrative law judge said, no, that doesn't apply to this case. I'm not going to allow that evidence. I think they should have been allowed to present their case. The judge could have said, or the law judge could have said, yeah, I'll accept that. I disagree with that. I'm not going to use it, but at least accept it. Give them a chance to present the evidence.
What do you think about this issue? Do you think states should change the absolute insurer rule? Take the poll on our website and let us know your thoughts. Ray, we've had a spike, unfortunately, of thoroughbred fatalities at Saratoga this year. We had a spike at Del Mar last year. There was the aqueduct fatalities a few years ago. Even though nationally, overall, the stats say racing fatalities are declining in the last several years. So this is obviously concerning. What do you make of it?
Well, it's concerning, but it should also be said that Saratoga was one of the safest tracks in the country last year. Del Mar had a spike, and they took some steps based on some data that comes out of something called the Equine Injury Database. The New York Racing Association is kind of taking some of those same steps right now, and that is identifying horses that are part of a population that may be more at risk. And we know this because of the Equine Injury Database. A couple of the examples would be horses that are 4 years old and have never started before. Those horses are more at risk than horses that raced at 2 and 3. Another population group that's more at risk are those horses that have been off for 120 days or more. Also horses that have been on the vets list before. So veterinarians are paying much closer attention to horses in those at-risk population groups during training hours, and especially after they've been entered to race. I think it's had a very positive influence on Del Mar having a much better safety record this year, and I think we're going to see improvements at Saratoga as well.
Well, I would hope so. But in looking, we did look at the data for what's happened at Saratoga, and there's not a common thread. It's been on the turf, it's been on the dirt, it's been on the Oklahoma training track, it's during races, after races, before races. So, to me, that makes me think of other issues. And some of those were identified in that study that came out of the aqueduct situation. A couple of those are, continuing education for trainers, making sure, and New York has a good program for that, but the trainers have to take advantage of it as well, and have that knowledge. I talked to Ed Bowen at the Grayson Jockey Club Research Foundation, and he was concerned that perhaps there's still a gap between the vet research that goes on and what happens at the track, how much the trainers know about what the research says. So, and you have to know both things. And he talked about Dr. Larry Bramlich saying, what's good for a horse cardiovascularly is different from what is good for a horse sound-wise and skeletal-wise. You got to know that, and you got to be able to spot things. And if you're overusing medication, which we know goes on, and vets are injecting horses with too much stuff, it can mask the opportunity to find these problems. And the research says pre-existing conditions, almost in 80% of the cases, pre-existing conditions existed when the horse broke down.
Right. Yeah, continuing education is a good thing. New York is one of only a handful of states that requires it for their licensed trainers. And I think the trainers look at it the wrong way. Nobody's saying that they're stupid or they don't know what they're doing, but there's so much science and so much research that's been done thanks to Grayson and other groups over the last 20 or 30 years. There's a lot that trainers can learn to make the sport safer, and that's what they want too. They do not want to have horses breaking down.
No.
None of us do. So
absolutely. All right, well, let's move on and talk about the Travers Stakes this weekend. Great field. I mean, you couldn't ask for more. You got the Belmont winner, the Preakness winner, and the Derby winner. They're all in the race. Some newcomers. What do you think?
I think we've got the second coming of Cigar here. Good Samaritan. Ran on the turf, was okay on the turf, but then he made one start on dirt in the Jim Dandy, and he won from off the pace. I think Bill Mott, who trained Cigar, has another horse here that's going to go on to a 16 race winning streak. What do you think? Starting in the Gin Dandy and continuing in the Travers.
I love your optimism. I can't imagine the horse having 16 more starts, knowing how breeding farms think these days. So, but he is very impressive, and I think he has a chance right now to take over the 3-year-old division if he wins the Travers and then performs well in the Breeders' Cup. He could be 3-year-old champion at the end of the year. There's another newcomer, just like last year. Bob Baffert has one in this race. His name is West Coast, and if you look at the stats around, the type of horse that he is coming into the race off this layoff, having won his last race, Bob Baffert's numbers are frankly ridiculous. And he did it last year with Arrogate. He could very well do it again with West Coast. But I'm going to pull for a horse that almost did it in the Haskell. I've liked him all along. I even had my GoPro on him before the Kentucky Derby, and that is McCracken. So I'm hopeful. I like the connections. I don't know if he wants to go 10 furlongs, but I'm pulling for him to pull the upset. McCracken.
Part of a tremendous card on Saturday. We've got, not only do we have the Travers, we've got Songbird coming back. We've got the Forego, the Sword Dancer. Tremendous card at Saratoga.
Absolutely. Good luck and enjoy. Another bet that you might think about making, because it's unbelievable carryover, is the Woodbine Jackpot Super High Five. It's the last race on each card. You can bet it tomorrow. You can bet it tonight. And there's a $1 million carryover right now. And even if you don't have the single winning ticket, it's still a 50% give back to the bettor. So it's a $500,000 at least. So it's a pretty good deal. The Super High Five Woodbine Jackpot, $1 million carryover. That's going to do it for this edition of the Friday Show. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.